Hello, Tanse, Itlanate, Ani, bonjour. Welcome back to Our Shared Politics. My name is Nova. I am a settler on Turtle Island. I created this podcast with the hope of highlighting our similarities instead of focusing on the differences and pushing people further apart. I wish to express acknowledgement that I am on Treaty 8 territory, home to the Tsetskane, Denizat, Nahiawak, Saulteaux, and BC Métis. It is essential I recognize all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, both status and non-status, as the guardians of these lands. As a non-Indigenous person, I play a role as a treaty partner, being represented by the government. My pronouns are she, her, but I also accept they, them, and I fall under the 2S LGBTQIA+ umbrella. Last episode, we went over Canada's involvement in the World Wars and the internment camps we established, amongst many other atrocities. Today, we're going to go over Canada's involvement in the Cold War period and our domestic policy during that general time, which will bring us up basically until the year 2000. Canada first addressed the threat posed by communism in a much more mild manner than in the USA. However, the Canadian government continued intensive surveillance of communists and shared that intelligence with the United States. Beginning in the 1950s, the RCMP had the Pro-Funct List, an acronym for Prominent Functionaries of the Communist Party, which was a top-secret project to identify and observe suspected Canadian communists. Beginning in the late 1950s, Indigenous children were removed from their homes and placed in foster homes, through which they would be adopted into a white family. This is now known as the 60s Scoop. Approximately 20,000 Indigenous children were removed from their communities and adopted out all over Canada and sometimes even across the border in the USA. Each province had its own system, with Saskatchewan having the only true targeted transracial adoption program known as AIM, or Adopt Indian Métis. Photos were taken of these children and descriptions were written and placed in newspapers. In 1956, there was the Trans-Canada Pipeline debate, which was basically on whether to use American pipelines to get Western Canadian oil to Eastern Canada. St. Laurent was opposed to using American pipelines and wanted to build pipelines entirely through Canada, which was the more expensive option. St. Laurent rushed to closure, causing many to believe the Liberals had become arrogant after 2 decades in power, and in a major upset, Conservative John Diefenbaker won the 1957 election, ending nearly 22 years of Liberal rule. In the end, the pipeline was built regardless. During St. Laurent's time in power, he oversaw the expansion of social programs, including family allowances, old age pensions, disability allowances, government funding of post-secondary education, and an early form of universal health care, as well as the introduction of the RRSP. Diefenbaker called for, quote, a new vision, a new hope, a new soul in Canada, end quote, and pledged to open the Canadian North to settlement. Where have we heard that one before? This quote by him in 1958 became known as the Vision. Quote, "This is the vision. One Canada where Canadians will have preserved to them the control of their own economic and political destiny. Sir John A. Macdonald saw Canada from east to west. He opened the west. I see a new Canada, a Canada of the North. This is the vision." End quote. Between 1950 and 1975, the RCMP slaughtered Inuit sled dogs, which I wonder if that was part of the vision for the North that Diefenbaker had. Estimates range up to 20,000 dogs being killed. Elders in many communities allege this was done in order to intimidate the Inuit and disrupt their way of life, as dog sledding was and still is a huge part of the Inuit culture. This went on to impact especially Inuk men in extremely harmful ways, such as alcoholism and suicide, as masculinity in the Inuit culture was closely tied to their dog sled teams. The dog slaughter, paired with the lack of cultural support, or fucking really any sport, has resulted in intergenerational trauma that is still ongoing today. On Dominion Day 1960, the Canadian Bill of Rights was introduced in Parliament and rapidly passed. Diefenbaker had begun drafting it as early as 1936, which guaranteed fundamental freedoms for Canadians. However, as a mere piece of federal legislation, it could be amended by any other law, and the questions of civil liberties were thus to a large extent a provincial matter. One lawyer remarked the document provided rights for all Canadians, quote, so long as they don't live in any of the provinces, end quote. In 1960, First Nations people finally gained the right to vote without having to give up their status. They were the last group of people to gain suffrage in Canada. In 1961, debate broke out in Parliament over whether Canada should accept U.S. nuclear weapons on its territory. Diefenbaker was against this and also took a more friendly policy towards Cuba than the Americans, believing in the rights of countries to establish their own forms of government. Technically, Inuit people were granted suffrage in 1950 when a Supreme Court decision confirmed that Inuit were distinct from First Nations peoples and were not subjected to the Indian Act under law. However, because ballot boxes were not placed in northern regions until 1962, many Inuit see this as the true date of suffrage. In the 1963 election, Liberal Lester B. Pearson won, and he accepted the American Warheads. During his time in power, Pearson brought in universal health care, though credit must be given to NDP leader Tommy Douglas, as well as the Canada Pension Plan and Canada Student Loans. He also instituted the maple leaf flag. French was made an official language of Canada, and the federal government began providing services in both French and English. I feel like now is a good time to expand slightly on Tommy Douglas. He was a premier of Saskatchewan and went on to become the leader of the NDP Party of Canada. As a child, he had dealt with a bone infection, which was treated but later flared up. His parents took him to the hospital, where the doctors told him the leg would have to be amputated as his parents could not afford the operations to attempt to cure it a second time. However, an orthopedic surgeon took interest in the case and agreed to treat him for free as long as his medical students could observe the surgery and learn from it. The subsequent operations saved his leg. Years later, he would say, quote, I felt that no boy should have to depend either for his leg or his life upon the ability of his parents to raise enough money to bring a first-class surgeon to his bedside, end quote. However, like most, if not all Canadian politicians, he has a terrible past that must be mentioned. In 1933, he received a master's in sociology for his thesis, quote, The Problems of the Subnormal Family, end quote, within which he recommended several eugenic policies. He proposed couples seeking marriage would have to be certified mentally and morally fit. Those deemed subnormal by his standards because of low intelligence, moral laxity, or STIs would be sent to farms, while those judged to be mentally defective or incurably diseased would be sterilized. He rarely mentioned this thesis later in life and never actually enacted eugenics policies by the time he took office 11 years later. However, I do want to point out that he became premier in 1944 when many people were now knowledgeable of Nazi Germany and their use of eugenics. If he would have been premier earlier, who knows whether these policies would have been implemented under him. I'll end up doing a whole episode on him exactly, Tommy Douglas, and what he did for the province of Saskatchewan and later Canada as a whole, but I just wanted to give a quick rundown here of who he was. In 1965, Project Surname began, which assigned last names to Inuit families. This was to replace the disc numbers that had been used since the 1940s in lieu of surnames for Inuit, and were similar to dog tags. Inuit had no need for family names prior to colonization and had a beautiful system of name-giving by the elders. Due to record-keeping requirements, colonizers decided on the disc number system. These discs had a hole to be threaded into a parka for safekeeping or worn around the neck. These discs were stamped with Eskimo Identification Canada around the edge and a crown in the middle. On the reverse side was a number. The number was broken down into several parts, with either an E or a W to indicate those who lived east or west of Ukshutug, followed by 1 or 2 digits indicating the area the person was from. The last set of digits would be specific to each Inuk and became their identity in government documents. The discs were used in Northwest Territories, which included present-day Nunavut at the time. In 1968, Liberal Pierre Trudeau became Prime Minister. Prior to this, as the Minister of Justice and Attorney General, he created more flexible divorce laws, decriminalized homosexuality, introduced maternity leave, partially legalized abortion, and fully legalized contraception. One of Trudeau's most famous quotes is, "The state has no business in the bedrooms of the nation." Once again, a seemingly great man for non-Indigenous Canadians. However, just the next year, in 1969, Trudeau, along with his then Minister of Indian Affairs, Jean Chrétien, proposed the 1969 White Paper. Under this legislation, Indian status would be eliminated. First Nations people would be assimilated fully into provincial government responsibilities as opposed to federal, as equal Canadian citizens. First Nations people are wards of the state. They are not true Canadian citizens. Under the Indian Act, they are a ward of the state. Reserve status would be removed, imposing private property laws. Any rights that had been given previously, such as hunting and fishing rights, would be eliminated and treaties would be terminated. In Trudeau's words, quote, "We can't recognize Aboriginal rights because no society can be built on historical might-have-beens," end quote. It's easy to say that when it's not your historical might-have-been that we're talking about. It's very easy to say that when you're the oppressor, when you're the one who's in the place of power. Basically, the government wanted to reduce costs and their responsibilities to the First Nations people they'd fucked over for at least a century. At a press conference, when asked by a woman, quote, "When did we lose our identity?" end quote, Chrétien responded, quote, "When you signed the treaties," end quote. Which, that wasn't a part of the treaties, was giving up any sort of identity. If anything, it was supposed to preserve their culture. They were supposed to keep their hunting and fishing rights, etc., etc. And it's appalling that the Minister of Indian Affairs apparently hasn't read the treaties. First Nations on unceded territory contended that because no treaties had ever been signed with them, they were still the lawful owners of the land, and the Crown had to return the land to them or pay full market price, which would have cost the Crown hundreds of billions of dollars, rightfully fucking so. Leaders of the National Indian Brotherhood gathered in Ottawa and endorsed the Red Paper as their official response to the White Paper. Trudeau withdrew the White Paper while saying at a press conference, quote, "We'll keep them in the ghetto as long as they want," end quote. Beginning in 1970, Highway 16 between Prince George and Prince Rupert in BC has been the location of many missing and murdered Indigenous women. There's no bus system, and so many women hitchhike to get to the next town or city. This has resulted in over 80 women and girls going missing along a 719-kilometer corridor of highway. On October 8, 1971, Trudeau's cabinet announced a multiculturalism policy, which was the first of its kind in the world, and the first of its kind in Canada, since we were still against Indigenous culture. Just hypocritical for you to turn around and announce this to the world as multicultural, when 2 years earlier you were trying to assimilate and take away a whole culture. A discrimination-free, points-based immigration system was enacted, also the first of its kind. This action signaled an openness to the world and opened immigration up to virtually every country. During this period, Canada played a middle power role in international affairs surrounding the Cold War and pursued diplomatic relations with communist countries that the US had severed ties with, such as Cuba and Red China after their revolutions. Trudeau refused to join the Organization of American States, disliking the support and tolerance for dictators. He removed nuclear weapons from Canadian soil, formally recognized the People's Republic of China, established a close relationship with Fidel Castro, if you know, you know, and decreased the number of Canadian troops stationed internationally. Trudeau never had great relations with Nixon and went so far as to say in a speech while in America, quote, "Living next to you is in some way like sleeping with a beast. No matter how friendly and even-tempered the beast, one is affected by every twitch and grunt," end quote. Nixon did not like him either, referring to him as that asshole Trudeau. This was due to trade disputes, defense agreements, fishing, energy, imperialism, and foreign policies. Trudeau condemned American bombings against Vietnam, and US Canada relations slowly brightened in 1976 when Canada joined the G7, and Trudeau and Jimmy Carter went on to have a better rapport. In 1976, Bill C-84 was passed by the House of Commons, which abolished the death penalty completely and instituted a life sentence of life without parole for 25 years for first-degree murder. And that just means basically that if you're ever given 25 to life, you have to serve 25 years before you can ever sit before a parole board, and they can continuously deny you parole, which is why it's to life. Because if it's a heinous enough crime, like Paul Bernardo, he's never getting out. Like, he got 25 to life doesn't mean he was only going to serve 25 years, but that's wildly misconstrued a lot of the times. That same year, the practice now known as Starlight Tours began. This is an extremely deceiving name, as they are the farthest thing from a peaceful starlit walk at night. These Starlight Tours are cases where police officers arrest Indigenous people, usually men, sometimes for allegedly being publicly intoxicated or being disorderly, but most of the time these arrests happen without cause. The officers then drive these people they are supposed to be serving and protecting to the outskirts of the city and abandon them. Sometimes taking shoes and jackets, always in sub-zero temperatures. This has resulted in deaths. However, no officer has ever been convicted of a freezing death. Most of these cases have taken place in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, but there have been others in the neighboring provinces of Alberta and Manitoba as well. At the end of the Vietnam War, thousands of people fled on boat to the British colony of Hong Kong, seeking refugee status. By 1979, Trudeau had accepted 44,000 of these Vietnamese refugees, marking Canada amongst the top destinations. During the 1979 election, the Conservatives focused on pocketbook issues and prodded at public exhaustion over constitutional debates, which is what I'm very worried is happening right now again. This led to Conservative Joe Clark being elected with a minority government. However, Clark decided as though he would govern as if he had a majority, refusing to form a coalition or cooperate with other parties in any way. Because of this, he was unable to get anything done while in office, and just months after taking office, his tenure was brought down by a non-confidence vote on his first budget, which triggered another election. Less than 10 months after the last one, Trudeau led the Liberals to another victory. However, this highlighted a sharp geographical divide in the country. The party had won no seats west of Manitoba. In 1980, Quebec had a referendum on Quebec sovereignty. Trudeau promised a new constitutional agreement in which Anglophone Canadians would have to listen to valid concerns made by the Québécois. 60% of Québécois voted to remain in Canada. In 1982, Canada implemented the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, with the addition that provincial governments would have the ability to use a notwithstanding clause to protect some laws from judicial oversight, which I do not get. If this is supposed to protect our laws and if this is supposed to protect our rights as Canadians, why is anything allowed to overrule that? Why do provincial governments or premiers have a veto power over citizens' rights? Why was that put in there? We've already seen the twist that has taken with the whole trans rights things that happened in Saskatchewan in October 2023. At the beginning of 1984, Trudeau resigned and passed leadership of his party on to John Turner. This ended Trudeau's 15-year tenure, marking him as Canada's third longest-serving prime minister. John Turner was only in power for about 3 months before Conservative Brian Mulroney won a majority government later that year in an early election. Despite the fact that Mulrooney referred to social programs as a sacred trust when he was opposition leader, he began to make cuts to social programs as soon as he came into office. Old age security was reduced, and he cut spending for EI as well as reducing the range of workers eligible. Universal family allowances ended, and a tax deduction was set for childcare expenses, benefiting high income families the most. The child tax credit was initiated, though, which did give a maximum of $85 per month per child up to the age of 18. So I guess that was a win. Mulroney and Ronald Reagan had a close relationship, which led to the increase of testing of American cruise missiles in Canada's north. The cooperation had begun in 1983 under Trudeau, but took place primarily under Mulroney. There were at least 23 tests conducted, an average of 2 to 3 per year, mostly around the Cold Lake region of Alberta and into the Northwest Territories. Although none were armed with nuclear warheads, many Canadians were still thoroughly against allowing the American military to test any capabilities in Canada. Between 1986 and 1991, Mulroney reduced the federal workforce by 1% each year, resulting in 11,000 federal employees being laid off. He transferred the costs of universal health care and higher education to the provinces, breaking tradition of the two levels of government splitting the costs. As a result, some provinces had to drop insurance coverage for certain medical procedures and prescriptions. In 1988, Mulroney delivered an apology to the Japanese Canadians who had been interned during World War II and announced a compensation package. The package included $21,000 to each surviving internee and the reinstatement of Canadian citizenship to those who had been deported to Japan. In 1989, Canada adopted a 9% GST to replace the hidden 13.5% manufacturer's sales tax. The GST did not apply to basic needs, but 80% of Canadians were still opposed to the tax, no matter how much the Conservative government argued it was a tax shift, not an increase. 2 Conservative MPs from Alberta even left the party, and Mulroney resorted to using the deadlock clause to push through the tax. When the tax finally became effective in 1991, the rate was lowered even further to only 7% GST. On December 6, 1989, an anti-feminist mass shooting happened at Ecole Polytechnique in Montreal, Quebec. The coward who did it entered the school with a legally obtained semi-auto rifle and a hunting knife. He declared he was fighting feminism before going on to shoot and kill 14 women, while another 10 women and 4 men were injured before taking his own life. In 1990, a land dispute between a group of Haudenosaunee people and the town of Oka, Quebec, led to what is now known as the Ganasudage resistance or the Oka crisis. This lasted 78 days, from July until September of 1990. Just for a bit of background, this is written in history as a land dispute, but what it should be recognized is another blatant colonizer land grab, which first began in 1673. A private golf course was then developed in 1959, and this brought the project to the border of the Pines, as well as a burial ground in use for over a century. The Pines was a tiny territory that the Haudenosaunee people had been forced to move to in the late 1880s, and now here the colonizers were again, 100 years later, picking up exactly where their ancestors had left off. Okay, so back to 1990. It was announced that the Pines would be clear-cut in order to expand to an 18-hole course and build 60 condos. The Haudenosaunee people obviously weren't going to let this happen again, so they created a barricade to block access to the area. A few days after the barricade was first erected, in the early hours of the morning, over 100 police personnel surrounded the resistors and their allies, taking up tactical positions in trees with semi-automatic weapons. A dozen women linked arms and walked towards the police, showing their intent for a peaceful interaction. However, because they expected everything to be done on colonial terms, the officers said they would speak with only one representative, which raised tensions. By the end of that first day, gunshots had been fired from both sides, and a corporal with the Sûreté de Quebec, which is Quebec's provincial police force, had been shot and killed. The SQ retreated, and upon their return, they established a perimeter around the area and blocked all access routes for food or medical treatment. Representatives from the Quebec Human Rights Commission were prevented from entering to witness what exactly was going on. The Haudenosaunee eventually were able to blockade a bridge, which frustrated commuters, and anger rose amongst residents. Some people assaulted an Indigenous woman trying to buy groceries and prevented her from leaving the store. Townspeople also burned multiple effigies of Indigenous warriors while chanting Sauvage. Quebecois radio hosts raised tensions with comments such as, quote, "They can't even speak French," end quote, and calling for, quote, "cleaning everything up by killing 50, 100, 125 people, burying them, and forgetting about it," end quote. Military leadership announced that tanks would be deployed and that the general was given, quote, "full autonomy to attack at will with the objective of obtaining unconditional surrender," end quote, from the resistance. Upon hearing this, families with children and elders attempted to flee and were met at the barricades by a crowd throwing huge rocks and chunks of concrete. Though the SQ had guaranteed safety to those evacuating, they failed to even attempt to stop any single crowd member from throwing projectiles, breaking windshields, and screaming terrible slurs. The military moved in and were able to push forward through the disputed territory, using aircraft to fly over and give them intelligence on the resistance. The federal government eventually bought the land from the developer to resolve the crisis. However, because the land title was never transferred into Haudenosaunee hands, this was only the most basic of resolutions. Furthermore, the final 24 protesters were reluctant to fully surrender without safety guarantees. This resulted in them defending a territory of only a few hundred meters, surrounded by the lake and over 400 soldiers with machine guns, armored vehicles, and helicopters. Journalists were forbidden from approaching the stronghold, and cell phone service was cut in the area. Anyone who left the small compound was arrested. Finally, the last standoff began. A resistor began walking around the perimeter installed by the Canadian forces, setting off flares that had been used to alert them to people fleeing the area. The soldiers turned a water hose on the man, but it didn't have enough pressure to disperse him and the crowd that was beginning to form. The crowd taunted the soldiers and threw water balloons, but neither side escalated further. It was on this day that the land defenders decided to end the struggle and began walking home. However, they were arrested upon leaving, and a struggle began. In the ensuing panic, a soldier bayoneted a 14-year-old girl near the heart, and she nearly died. I recommend everyone go on YouTube and watch Rocks at Whiskey Trench by NFB. It's about an hour and a half long or so, but it's the story of the resistance by those who lived through it. Please, this summary was just the Coles Notes version, so it's really important to hear the first-hand accounts. In November 1990, a teenage boy named Neil Stonechild was murdered by officers with the Saskatoon Police Service during a Starlight Tour. He was only 17 and had been picked up illegally before being abandoned in a field where the temperatures were at least minus 28. Neil's friend, Jason Roy, was there that night when Neil was taken. He stated that the last time he saw Neil alive was locked in the back seat of the police cruiser with blood running down his face, and the last words Jason heard his friend say were, quote, "Jay, help me, they're going to kill me," end quote. The Roy family was ultimately put into an RCMP witness protection program. Although Neil's body was found only days later, the internal investigation surprisingly found no foul play. Yeah. On December 2nd, 1991, Canada became the first Western nation to recognize Ukraine as an independent country. In 1992, Mulroney's Fisheries and Oceans Minister declared a moratorium on Atlantic cod fishery, which had been the main economy in the Newfoundland and Labrador region for 500 years and had provided nourishment for generations. The moratorium was declared after the cod levels had dropped to only 1% of its historic level, and this resulted in over 35,000 people immediately becoming unemployed. This was the largest one-day job loss in Canadian history. Mulroney resigned in 1993, leading to the Conservative Kim Campbell taking over leadership of the party. Before Mulroney, Canada held 61 Crown corporations. By the end of his tenure, he had sold off 23 of them to private companies, including Air Canada and Petro-Canada. In his final days of office, Mulroney made sure to take a European farewell tour using Canadian federal funds. In the earlier years of the Somali Civil War, the Canadian Airborne Regiment was stationed in Somalia, participating in humanitarian efforts, or at least that's what we were supposed to be participating in. However, on March 16th, 1993, a CAR captain found 16-year-old Shadane Aron hiding in an abandoned American base and assumed he was trying to sneak on to the Canadian base to steal supplies. The captain turned Shadane over to another soldier who led him to a bunker being used to house munitions. Shadane tried to resist, pleading he was simply trying to find a lost child. I'm not going to go into great detail here, but 16-year-old Shadane was horribly abused by the Canadian soldiers over the course of the evening and into the night. The abuse included waterboarding, putting out cigarettes on various body parts, including genitals, and sexually assaulting him with a broomstick. At least 16 trophy photos were taken by the soldiers participating. There were 2 soldiers directly involved in the abuse, but it is estimated that up to 80 other soldiers could hear or observe the beating and did not intervene. The corporal on duty was asked to check out a, quote, long, dragged-out howl, end quote, but the corporal refused to put his Game Boy down and go investigate. The Canadian government tried to sweep it under the rug, which is right out of our playbook at this point. This murder came at a sensitive time in Canada as Kim Campbell was currently running to become Prime Minister. She tried to dismiss the allegations of racism in the military by referring to it as youthful folly and suggested it was normal. After an investigation finally took place, it became known that 3 out of the 4 men facing the most serious charges had been given mefloquine, an anti-malarial drug that was not approved for use in Canada. The drug was known to cause paranoia, lack of judgment, and aggression. The trials that followed show charges dropped against one of the main perpetrators as he had attempted to hang himself in prison, resulting in brain damage and him no longer being a threat to society. The second was convicted of manslaughter and torture, which is absolute bullshit. Manslaughter means you did not mean to kill him. Did you really think that after all that abuse, it would not result in death? I guess that's where the drug side effects come in and they were able to plead their case. Another pled guilty to negligent duties, but not guilty to torture. He was convicted and served 90 days. Deemed willfully blind and demoted to private. The prosecution appealed, thank God, and he was then given 1 year's imprisonment and dismissal from Canadian forces. The next 6 soldiers were acquitted of causing bodily harm, but convicted of negligent performance of duty, with only 1 serving 90 days, and most, but not all of them, being dismissed from the forces. A public outcry finally happened around November 1994 when a publication ban was lifted against the 16 photos taken of the torture session and were widely published in Canadian media. There were many, many cases of racism in the military, none of which had been taken seriously up until now. This event caused the disbandment of the Canadian Airborne Regiment and a shattering of the image that Canadians had when they imagined their peacekeeping military. I just don't get it. That's like our Abu Ghraib. I don't know if you guys know that what happened there with the Americans, but that was a bad one too. That was in the early 2000s with the Americans. Ours was 93. We're no better. People like to say that Canada doesn't have any racism or Canada's not a racist country. We fully are. We're just way better at hiding it than the Americans. Kim Campbell is the first and only woman so far to become Prime Minister of Canada, although she was only in power for 132 days and was not a shining example of what a woman Prime Minister should have been. The 1993 election legally had to happen as Parliament was due to expire from the last election. During this campaign, the Conservatives released smear ads focusing on the opponent's, Jean Chrétien, facial deformity caused by Bell's policy. These 4 televised ads include still pictures of his face with comments like, "Is this a prime minister?" and "I would be very embarrassed if he became Prime Minister of Canada." Chrétien wasn't fazed, saying, quote, "God gave me a physical defect, and I've accepted that since a kid. It's true that I speak on one side of my mouth. I'm not a Tory. I don't speak on both sides of my mouth." End quote. This caused major public backlash against the Conservatives, leading to Liberal Jean Chrétien winning a landslide majority with 2/3 of the seat. By comparison, the Conservatives were reduced to only 2 seats and lost official party status. At the beginning of 1994, the NAFTA agreement was signed, opening up free trade between Canada, Mexico, and the USA. This eliminated the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement that had been signed less than a decade prior. In 1995, the government passed the Canadian Firearms Registry, requiring the registration of all firearms in Canada. This was spurred by the Ecole Polytechnique Massacre 6 years earlier. In late 1995, Quebec had yet another referendum about whether to separate from Canada. The no side was complacent, assuming they would be victorious again. In the weeks leading up to the votes, however, the polls showed the we side was going to win. The no side did end up winning, but with only 50.58% of the vote. Whoa. This led to a Quebecois separatist breaking into the Prime Minister's personal residence at 24 Sussex Drive, armed with a knife, until security came. Not very climactic. From 1950 until 1997, approximately 28 additional residential schools had been opened. The last residential school, Kavalik Hall, in Kingiquan, Nunavut, closed in 1993, a mere 27 years ago. According to the government, there were 139 residential schools across Canada. However, this number excludes schools that operated without federal funding. PEI never had a physical school on the island, but their children were taken to Nova Scotia. New Brunswick never had federally funded schools, but Protestant schools had been attempted even before Confederation. In 1999, Nunavut became the 3rd and final territory to join Confederation, separating from the Northwest Territories, and with that, so-called Canada was complete. And I don't remember which episode it was. It was either the very end of part 1 of this series, or it was the very beginning of part 2. We talked about the representation in the House of Commons in Ottawa. for the provinces. And I can't remember exactly what they were at this point. But today, there are 338 members from 10 provinces and 3 territories, 42 for British Columbia, 34 for Alberta, 14 for Saskatchewan, 14 for Manitoba, 121 for Ontario, 78 for Quebec, 10 for New Brunswick, 11 for Nova Scotia, 4 for Prince Edward Island, 7 for Newfoundland and Labrador, and 1 each for Yukon, the Northwest Territories, and Nunavut. And so that is how many members they have in their House of Commons to represent their population size. As always, thank you for joining me today. I drop a new episode every Monday morning at midnight, so check back in next week to see what I'll be sharing with you then. If you or a loved one you know uses drugs, please keep in mind that you can call 1-888-688-6677 to contact the National Overdose Response Services to access support while using and especially using alone. And there is a Brave app with a use alone timer that connects you to a paramedic if you don't respond. Everyone, please consider picking up a free naloxone kit and keep it on hand 24/7. If you're unaware of where you can pick one up, you can simply Google naloxone kit plus your province. If you've learned something new today, it'd be awesome if you'd click that button and follow along for next time. Or if you'd like to contact me with feedback, you can email me at oursharedpodcast@gmail.com. Smell you later.